a Facebook page, and we're developing. A lot of people are on it now. We've got a core team of people who are, putting together all this stuff and getting all the paperwork together for it. At this point, what we need to have is as many people as possible. We're approaching groups initially, the biggest groups, and saying that they need to write a letter to the, what is it called now, the NCUA, National Credit Union Association.
Okay.
That says, our group has X number of members and we don't have a credit union and we would really like one, and if we can get that going, here's, we got this many people who would potentially join up. So there's a minimum number of people they have to have listed who would be interested, not by name, but just basically get an idea.
Okay.
You don't have a credit union for a dozen people.
Right.
You have to have a credit union. But if you've got several thousand people who would be potential, then it goes to the next stage of the stuff, with the licensing and registration. It's complicated, a lot of steps.
I bet.
And I'm not a banker. But we got bankers. We got bankers in it, and that's kind of what this had to wait for, is to get pagan bankers. And now we have everybody. We got doctors and lawyers and bankers and candlestick makers and everybody.
How exciting!
It is, and I feel that the credit union thing is a really important dimension, because as it stands now, we all bank somewhere, but the banks make money off of us, and they use it for their own purposes. Like mostly they use it to make rich people richer, and to pay campaign finances for the people that they like, which are generally not the same people we might like.
Right.
To put it mildly.
Yes.
So I really feel that having our own banking system is going to be a crucial part to this next stage of our development as a community.
As a community, very important.
Because, for example, banks, one of the big things that banks do is real estate stuff. People want to buy property, the banks make mortgages.
Right.
If people default, banks end up with the property.
That's
banks
right.
own vast amounts of property just
Right.
that way. And
So there's profit for it.
and there is, and we need that. We need to have our own lands. I feel that over the years, since the 60s, when it was each decade has had its own kind of agenda in our community. Back in the 60s, the major thing was groups getting founded and started and getting themselves together and kind of launching a community.
Right.
And then in the 70s, we started having festivals and gatherings that people would come and meet each other, because there was enough of us to do that.
Right.
And then, and also publications. I mean, Green Egg, for
Green
example,
Egg,
as everybody knows. So we started communicating with each other, and the founding of various councils and groups and stuff. So it was all around that, talking to each other, meeting each other, talking to each other, establishing groups. Then we got into the 90s, and we started getting into internet stuff. It was initially it was bulletin board things, and chat rooms and stuff, and that grew. So getting electronic community was a big part of the 90s. And then we started getting businesses. We started getting our own pagan businesses. We got craftspeople and musicians and artists and people who started developing, real money-making enterprises of various sorts. Well, hopefully, some of them were unintentionally nonprofit. Some of them were deliberately nonprofit. And
yes,
authors,
a lot of authors.
Yeah, and the books, of course. Back in the early days, there were very, very few books, and now we've got, hundreds, maybe thousands. I don't even know how many books. Everybody's
Along with online publications, lots of online publications, including small ones like ours, and the Wild Hunt, which is a very large one, and
oh yeah, right.
yeah, there's a bunch of them now.
Witches and Pagans and Wild Hunt and networks like Witchvox and that kind of stuff. So, and as this has happened, more and more people have become aware that there is a community, and when that happens, more and more people says, "Hey, I'm a pagan too."
I'm a pagan too.
And they want to come in, and then we get to say that wonderful, beautiful phrase. We get to say, "Welcome home," which I just love that. Every pagan festival you go to now has a big banner that says "Welcome home" over the entrance. And I just think that's so beautiful, because I really feel that's what it's been for all of us going along, is that we were all, orphans of the storm, changeling children like the characters in all the stories. And to find each other and to find that we have community.
Yes.
We have a little myth in our family that I think is really relevant to all this. And the story goes, once upon a time, at the end of the Ice Age, we lived in a little village, as the glaciers retreated way up on the edges of whatever it was. And over the centuries, people lived in the village, and they died and were buried in the village, and they returned to be born again in the village. And people were buried in orchards, and the trees were planted, and the cycle continued over thousands of years.
Yes.
And then the Romans came, and they burned the village, and they murdered most of the people, and the ones they didn't kill, they hauled off into slavery in Rome and stuff. And when they died, there was no village to come back to. There were no people to return to. And we got scattered over the globe in incarnation after incarnation, always searching for our people. And finally now, we're finding each other.
Yep.
However scattered we've been, however many nations we've been, and of course it wasn't just one village, of course, it was all of us, because that was the pagan world.
Now it's a technological village.
Exactly. It's now a technological.
Technology has really given us a boost. I have a question for you.
Of course.
Do you think that we're living in another renaissance, a magical renaissance like we did in the 60s?
Well, now that is the subject of my major stuff these days.
Okay.
Right here. Check this little, right inside this little thing, I've got a little analysis of all of the Renaissance periods that I've recorded back into the Italian Renaissance in the 1480s. And every 60 years, like clockwork. There's been a Renaissance.
You gave me goosebumps. I kind of noticed that too.
Yeah, well, I think we're feeling that.
We're feeling that.
As we look around, And we are now, well, the last one was, of course, the 60s.
Yes.
And in the 1960s, in that cultural renaissance, is when all the movements were found that have changed the world since, free speech, sexual liberation, women's movements, environmental movements, social justice, civil rights. Just think of all the movements. They all began in the 60s.
Yep.
Gay rights, of course, that was a big one. Well, just everything. It's really changed the world since then, and we have changed the world.
Yes, for sure.
In the Church of All Worlds, when we first began, and we really trace our beginning back to 1962, because I went to college in 1961. Was my beginning of college. I was in high school in the 50s, just like in all those movies and stories. I always say I grew up in Pleasantville. If you've seen that, that was the world of high school for me. And it was the world of high school in all the comics and all the movies and all the TV shows. Even decades later, high school always took place in the 50s somehow.
Yeah.
Well, and then the 60s is when I went off to college. So I was right in the middle of these cultural archetypes.
It was just a perfect melting pot, and you were like a product of the time that just came forth.
I was. And through the 50s, I was kept nurtured intellectually and spiritually by the juvenile science fiction novels of Robert Heinlein.
Oh, okay.
And he wrote during that period. Those were the Harry Potter books of my era. That they were about young people growing up and learning to be what it meant to be fully human. Boys and girls. I mean, they were both. But it wasn't all about the same character like the Harry Potter. There were different stories about different characters, but they were still, young people growing up in different worlds. And the whole series culminated in 1961 with Stranger in a Strange Land.
Stranger in a Strange Land, yes.
And that was the most profound science fiction novel that ever been written, because it was the first one that addressed things like sex and religion and theology and relationships. Nobody had ever talked about that.
Cracked open that egg for everybody to see the yolk inside.
It really did. It cracked open the egg and
the green egg too.
The green egg. I know. That's. There were many reasons why we adopted the title Green Egg for the magazine. People would often ask, and we would always have different answers because there's so many meanings around both egg and green. What it all means, but it's all about potential. Is what it's all about. Both of those things. Green is the color of new life, and the egg is the potential. It could be anything when you open it. What are you going to get in this egg? Is it going to be, turkey, or is it going to be a velociraptor? You
Right.
don't know, until it hatches. So, Stranger in a Strange Land was the science fiction book club selection in October of 1961, and of course, and when I went to college that year was the first time I met somebody else who was my kind of person.
Okay.
Lance Christie was his name, and both of us, well, like so many of us, we were, changeling children.
Kindred
Ugly
spirits.
ducklings, and so on, looking for a kindred spirit, and we found each other right away, and we totally hit it off. So the book came out, and he read it over Christmas vacation, and he brought it back and he said, "You got to read this book," And I read it over spring break, and I said, "Wow, this lays out the kind of a thing that we've been talking about and thinking about all our lives, really." And so, if you read the book, you familiar with the book?
I have not read the book.
You have not read. Well, I'll give you the basic concept. It's really pretty simple. Basically, the idea is that the first human expedition to Mars fails. It crashes. Everybody's killed. There's a whole colony ship. Everybody's killed, but one of the women was almost to term with pregnancy because she'd gotten pregnant on the journey. This is men and women, families, whole thing. And everybody's killed, but it turns out that there is an ancient, unknown race of Martians living underground, and they discover the wreck, and they discovered that there's this baby that they were able to rescue and raise up.
Okay.
Well, they had no idea what humans were. They knew nothing about this. Where did this thing even come from? But they raised this kid up in their culture, and they're ancient and wise, and they have psychic gifts and all kinds of stuff, a different perspective. Well, 20 years later, another expedition from Earth finally gets there, and this time it's totally successful. And the crew is a diverse crew of people from every culture and religion and walk of life, chosen deliberately because we're going to start a new colony. You really want to have representations of everybody. So it's chosen for that, for total diversity recognition. And they find this kid who's now 20 years old there, and they bring him back to Earth. Well, he's not really exactly human. He's not really exactly an Earth person, but he's physically and ancestrally is. And so he looks at everything on Earth that we take for granted, all of our institutions, our attitudes, our ways, from that alien perspective. And in that process, the reader becomes one of the people in the ship. Whatever diverse category there is in the ship, one of them is us, and we become a part of that whole crew.
One of those immersive.
Exactly. It's totally immersive. And so the reader becomes a part of the folks that kind of gather around and follow this guy. His name is Valentine Michael Smith. That's his name. And in the process, everything gets a fresh look at. Our attitudes about everything. And this ends up with creating a new religion, and the reason for that is Heinlein himself says, who is also a part of the story as the wise mentor, Jubal Harshaw, which is really the author's putting himself in the story as well. And so he offers counsel and mentorship and advice and stuff like that. And after all, he'd been doing that for decades with all the other books he'd written. He'd been that with our whole generation. And he says, religion is a null area in the law in America. If you can establish yourself as a legal church, you can pretty much do anything you want to because of the First Amendment.
Yep.
That prohibits any laws restricting the practice of religion.
Right.
So that seems like a good idea. And so the hero and his people found this church they call the Church of All Worlds, because it's meant to be all-inclusive, to bring in the wisdom of all peoples, of all cultures, of all ways, and weave it around a common thread. And that common thread is immanent divinity. The deity isn't something out there somewhere. It's within us. As Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven is within you, all that stuff. And all of these great faiths, this takes the essential teachings and wisdom of all the world's religions and peoples and kind of weaves it into a coherent message. So that's the message. And in this particular religion, this Church of All Worlds, we have priestesses introduced. Well, there are no priestesses in any of the world's religions, except pagans.
Yep.
We're the only ones that have priestesses. So the whole position of women, it becomes a really significant one in all this. And The idea of the goddess is a part of this. And they also established ritual nudity and polyamory and all kinds of things that were just like, whoa, back then. And the central rite of the entire thing is water sharing. Because on Mars, water is a rare commodity.
Okay.
Well, we now know that there's a lot more water on Mars than we thought there was because it's just frozen. But still, Mars was considered to be a very desert, and basically it's a desert planet. So to share water is to share the essence of life.
Right.
Because water is the essence of life. It's the medium of our life. We're mostly water. You know? Lovely bags of mostly water, to paraphrase a Star Trek. And so when you share water with someone, it's like the blood brother ceremony in Native Americans.
Kind of figured that's what it was.
It's a bond that you have. You become water brothers and sisters. Water kin is what we say. But it also, even in a larger circle, in a community, it still affirms our kinship.
Right.
The sharing of water at every level affirms our kinship, because it's a thing we share with all life. Everywhere, really. Now we know that much more. We know that water is all over the universe, that the water of Earth has all come from space, and is still coming in, and that the comets have brought life to Earth and everywhere else. Life didn't originate on Earth. It's been brought here. And everywhere. If it came here, it's going to be everywhere. You know? So it's a profound thing. So the real ritual of sharing water was crucial. So on April 7th of 1962, Lance and I sat down and shared water. And that was the beginning of all of this. And we found other people like ourselves. We'd find somebody really cool, and we'd hand them this book and we'd say, "Here, read this, think you might like it." And they'd come back and say, "Wow, this is really cool." We'd say, "Well, here, never thirsted, offer water." And by the time we graduated, there was about 100 of us who were our little water brotherhood. And it was sort of like a secret society, a little fraternity.
Right.
We all adopted magical names. It was our first magical names. Mine was Prometheus. If you know the legend of Prometheus, you can understand why I would have chosen it.
Fits perfectly.
It did. It really is. So that was my first magical name, was Prometheus. And well, that's how it really began, this whole thing. And by the time we graduated and went off to graduate school at different places, we were scattered. And so we began a discussion, communicating with little newsletters that we put out and stuff, and letters, about whether we should continue this as a kind of an underground secret society or whether we should go public with it. Because in the story, the idea of having a public church of all worlds was a way of letting people know who you are. But there was also a danger there, because, well, there were some ideas that people might take offense at, you know? And in the story, it culminates with the villagers with the torches and pitchforks coming and burning the place down, you know? Well, I don't want to give away too much because it's still a good story, but you get the idea.
I get the idea.
Our mission statement was to make the world safe for people like us. And our concept of people like us was pretty broad. You know?
Yeah. There's a bunch of different ones.
It wasn't some limited little thing. It was pretty much all of us.
Here's another question for you.
Okay.
Do you think that technology today is perpetuating a longer period of new renaissance for Magic? Because I've noticed that the decades they keep going, and we're still going at it, and it hasn't stopped momentum. Every time I turn around, there's thousands and millions more people getting on social media, like the Etsy witches and the Twitter witches, and all different kinds of social media sites that just has all these amounts of people on there now.
It is.
And wanting to live the lifestyle. But like I said, I've noticed that it's getting longer. Instead of it just dying out, it just keeps getting longer.
It does.
It might not stop, you think, huh?
I don't think it's going to stop. I think we've reached escape velocity. I think we're
Okay.
going to just keep on going with this. I had that insight a few years back, well, actually 10 years back it's been. We first went public with the Church of All Worlds in St. Louis in 1967. Decided, okay, it was time to come out, and let the world know here we are. And if you think you want to be here, come on over. It was basically like that. And somebody asked the fatal question on Thursday, September 7th, 1967. I remember it very well. I was invited to give a talk at a local beatnik coffee house on this new religion thing. And somebody said, what kind of a church is this? Are you a Christian sect? Are you one of these Eastern? What are you? And I said, well, I guess you could say we're pagans.
Uh-oh.
And that's how it began. Because nobody had ever claimed to be pagan before. Pagans was always somebody else.
Yep.
Usually spoken with scorn and derision.
Yep.
You know? But to claim to be pagan, nobody had done that. So that's how it began. That was the first seed. Well, what I've seen happening in the intervening years, what I get asked most in interviews, every interview I do always now has this question. They say, what are the biggest changes you've seen in the community?
That was my next question for
Right.
you.
Well, yeah, it is. It's a good question, really, because over that length of time, there have been changes. And many of the people, many of the groups that are organized groups, kind of look down, look askance at the proliferation of solitaries and people who are unaffiliated, people who've only read a book somewhere,
Right.
and they're not a part of a group, and they haven't really been trained, and they're not working and practicing in the group, but there's a lot of them. According to
there
the
is a lot.
surveys, about half of the people who identify as pagan say they're solitaries. So the people who are part of groups, you know, are not entirely pleased with this. They
Yep.
feel that, well, people should be getting their training. But I look at that differently. I mean, I'd say the vast majority of people identify as Christians are not clergy. They don't go to church. They're not participating on any regular thing. They may, you know, show up for Christmas and Easter for the
Right.
ceremony. They think of themselves as Christian. They may send their kids to Sunday school and stuff, but they're the laity. They're just the people. And in pagan times, it was the same way. Everybody in the village wasn't a witch.
Right.
Everybody in the village wasn't a druid, you know. But they were all pagans, you know. And come around the wheel of the year, everybody would show up for the harvest festivals and the turning of the year, and they light the bonfires of the times and dance the maypole or whatever it was. Everybody did that, but the people who were actually the practitioners and members of the clergy were very few people.
Right.
I mean, you'd have one village witch maybe. It was witchcraft. She was the herbalist and midwife, and she was usually a widow living on the edge of the town with her little herb garden. And you'd have the village blacksmith and the village potter, and everybody had their craft.
They're different crafts.
Exactly. But everybody didn't practice the same craft, and I think that's an important understanding. Well, today, with the internet proliferating, everybody can be a part of this.
Yes.
And we're developing a global community.
Yes.
So the concept of the village has now become a global concept everywhere. And I've traveled all over the world, you know, not just here, but everywhere I go, there's pagan community. And they celebrate the turning of the seasons at the same times. Now, in the south of the equator, the seasons are reversed. So Yule is celebrated at June 21st, you know, and so on it goes. But the same songs are chanted, are sung, the circle is cast, you know, and all the stuff goes on. And there is this sense of global village that we have. Now, as I travel around, I will stop somewhere for gas or a bite to eat or something. And I'll come in and somebody, maybe the clerk or somebody will say, "Oh, I like your jewelry." and that's always the key word. They always say that, "I like your jewelry." And I'll say, "Yeah, well, you know," and we'll kind of smile, exchange look, and they'll reach in and pull out their pedicle. And we'll have a few words and a nice little smile because we're everywhere. And in the sense of kinship, it transcends all the other cultural barriers that people might have. There's that sense of that we are all part of a global village community. And the internet is making that possible in incredible ways. But I see we're just at the beginning. Over the next coming decade, the technology is going to take us to places that we've only imagined in fantasy and science fiction. For example, one of the big things in the whole Star Trek thing is the transporter. Well, physically, and the way it's presented, that's not a feasible thing. You know, you can't. If you try to maybe replicate a person like a fax machine or something and make it reproducible there, well, you still have the original one. Then you have two, and how do you deal with that? But if you destroy the one, then you create a new one. What happens to the spirit? The soul?
Destroy the soul.
But here's another way. We now have the ability, which is going to get much better quickly over time, especially with quantum computing and quantum entanglement communications, to to transport ourselves virtually anywhere. Just like the holographic communication kind of thing.
Okay.
So if we had a receiving station on Mars, for example, or one of the planets around Proxima Centauri, which is over 4 light years away, and you put on your glasses or whatever it will be at that particular time, you'd be able to be there instantly.
That would be awesome.
You know, and you'd be able to look around and visit with other people who may also be joining you virtually. And there may be nobody there physically, but it doesn't matter anymore. It's not about the physicality, it's about the presence, the consciousness. And we're now at that stage where we'll be able to project our consciousness into a visible recreation, an avatar, anywhere.
That's really exciting.
Think about that. You want to have a ritual Stonehenge. You know, everybody puts on their glasses, pushes a little button, dials up Stonehenge.
That's Stonehenge.
And there you are.
That's awesome.
Now, ordinary people passing through wouldn't see anybody there, but for all the people who joined in, we're all there together.
If I asked for you Dumbledore, would you get mad?
Oh, yeah.
If I asked for you Dumbledore, would you get mad?
No, not at all. I am the headmaster of the School of Wizardry, so close enough. In actuality, yes.
Wow.
Terry, join us?
I'm here with my mom. She's in another store.
Well, damn. Well, bring her over.
No, she's not going to do that.
All right. Well, hi anyway. Bye-bye. So, the biggest opening that I'm seeing at this point, there's two. One is developing quantum entanglement as a means of communication that will be universal, simultaneous, instantaneous. That's going to be profound. That's huge. No more time lag.
Exciting.
And the other one is virtual reality. When we combine those two things, you don't have to physically go anywhere because that doesn't really matter. If the matter is creating an avatar somewhere, whether it's in Second Life or on Mars, and being able to enter into that is if you're there physically. And after
just
all,
as real.
what are we? What is this other than an avatar in this game that we were all in? And the latest fringe element of quantum physics is what they call the simulation hypothesis. That has it that we are all in the matrix, and we are creating this collectively all the time. We do. We create it by our imagination and our dreams and our hopes. And in that particular case, these are no more real than the avatars that we created in Second Life or in our gaming worlds and stuff. So, given that, the possibilities really expand. It also means, of course, that death is not a real thing. We don't actually die; we just res out. And then we go back to the source, and then we decide, well, do we want to come back in and play another game? Let's see if we can come up with a new avatar that we want to be this time around. People are even now beginning to decide that they want to change their avatars in this world right here. We're getting a whole batch of people wanting to transition to a slightly different version of whatever. So all of these things are part of what we're going to be dealing with in the years to come. And also, of course, being as how this is a new cultural renaissance, each of these has had a name throughout all of history. And this one has already been given a name, the Awakening.
Awakening.
So I think we're going to be seeing a kind of a global awakening of shared consciousness. The internet is like a nervous system.
Right.
It's a vast network of communication, just like what goes on in our brain and what goes on at the greater scales of the universe.
Right.
When I give a regular talk on this stuff, I have all these great pictures that I show of, okay, here's the network of the human brain. Here's the mycelium network of the mushrooms.
It's like the universe.
And here's the universe. And all these are the same pattern, the same structure. You've seen this.
I've seen them.
So when we look at it like that, the idea of being separate, becomes absurd.
Right.
We're all interconnected. So I think it's very exciting. This is an exciting time, but it's also a time for each one of these eras, these 60-year cycles, those who come of age in the one cycle, 60 years later, become the old wise women and wizards and wise women and stuff to mentor and pass on the wisdom to the next generation of young folks coming in. So passing the torch is an important part.
Very important. That's what I'm here for. Passing the torch.
So there you are. So anyway, there's That's probably a longer answer than you wanted for that.
If somebody ever asked you to go to space, would you go to space?
I would.
You would?
In fact,
You'd be the first wizard in space then.
yeah, and you know,
that we know of.
Elon Musk has said that he wanted to send somebody on a trip around the moon in sometime in the mid-2020s, and some Japanese guy bought all the tickets for the whole flight. A huge amount of money.
I bet.
And he says he's going to give free rides to artists that he selects. That he thinks it would be really cool to send people out into space to come back with their impressions of what they feel.
You have to be one of them. You have
I'm
to be.
applying. I am applying. So, you know.
How exciting.
So there you go. Yes, I would in a heartbeat.
I have another question.
Okay.
A few months ago, I saw a post on one of your Facebook pages that spoke about the lawsuit that you were involved in over the image of that they used inside for the what's the name of that? The Headmaid's Tale.
Yes.
Did you ever settle that?
Yes, I did.
Well, good. I hope it was
I
in your favor.
able to arrange a licensing agreement with MGM, Hulu, and now each new season, I get after the season is completed, I get a royalty check,
Awesome.
and theoretically, it's supposed to get credits at the end of the show. Now, the current third season omitted the credits, so now I have to get back to them and say, well, I think you owe me a little bit here because of that. But yes, I got that worked out. Only through the intervention of the author, Margaret Atwood herself,
Awesome.
who one of my students was able to approach and establish a relationship. And now she and I have become great friends.
That's awesome.
And she went directly to the top people in the company, because up to that point, I was just my lawyer talking to their lawyer and not getting anywhere.
Right. They love doing that.
Yep. But we did it, so now we're good with
Good.
that.
They
Now
need to
I'm
give
dealing with
credit.
Disney. That's the latest thing.
What's going
Well,
on with
the
Disney?
movie Moana, if you've seen it, it's a beautiful movie.
Okay.
The culmination of the movie, the culmination is the awakening of this island as a goddess.
Okay.
And the image that they use is absolutely identical to my image of the millennial Gaia.
The millennial Gaia.
And so I put together a whole batch of information about this, and lots of pictures, and pages and pages of testimony, and the fact that if you Google online Moana or My Gaia or any of these things, all the pictures come up together. And stores are now selling my statue and advertising it as related to the movie.
Yeah.
So I've sent all this stuff to Disney, and I got a letter back from them not too long ago saying, well, that's very interesting. We've received your communication. We'll get back to you. And I feel pretty certain that we're going to be having some productive conversation about this.
That's awesome. Good news.
So that's kind of exciting. So these are some of
Exciting.
the exciting things going on in my life. And,
Awesome.
and it's the magic, you know?
It is.
It really is. Morning Glory, my beloved life mate of 40 years.